Hello, my name is Tjalling Erkelens and I'm the founder and CEO of Bedrocan. And you are listening to Professionally Cannabis.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night?
Hello and welcome to the Professionally Cannabis podcast. I'm Johnny Weiser and with me is my friend Oscar Hausman. Today's episode, we interviewed one of the most influential figures in European cannabis, if not global cannabis. Oscar, who do we have on the pod today?
Our guest today is Tjalling Erkelens. Bedrocan was the first company to produce GMP cannabis. That's cannabis grown to the pharmaceutical good manufacturing practice standard. A consistent amount of THC and CBD in every gram. And starting from small beginnings in the Netherlands in the 90s, it's now become the leading exporter of herbal cannabis flower in the world, with, I believe it's the biggest import in Germany, Italy, it goes to Greece, Scandinavia, Australia, you name it. If there are patients with medicinal cannabis through the pharmaceutical system, they probably have Bedrocan, or at least access to it. So it's with great pride, listeners, that I present to you one of the biggest voices in our industry. I hope you enjoy.
Absolutely right. So let's get straight into it.
Where do they go, the smoke
Hello
rings
and
I
welcome
blow
to the Professionally
each
Cannabis
night?
podcast. Today I am delighted to say that we are joined by none other than Tjalling Erkelens, co-founder and CEO of Bedrocan. As the exclusive contract manufacturer to the Dutch government, and with Bedrocan being one of the most widely used medical cannabis suppliers across Europe, we have the perfect person here to chat everything European cannabis. Tjalling, welcome to the Professionally Cannabis podcast.
Thank you and happy to be here.
Perfect. So, Tjalling, the question we ask our guests as they first enter the pod is, what led you to the plant?
Being born and raised in the Netherlands, and they start smiling immediately. Obviously, we have seen a lot of plant already in the Netherlands from the 70s onward. Being raised in that period, of course, you get familiar with the material in a way that you see and you know what is happening around you. But when the plant really first came to me and to my mind, we were already kind of working with it from a more horticultural perspective, producing seeds. But when our Minister of Health back in 1997 announced a program for medicinal cannabis, and it was one of the things that I had been thinking about. You know, you heard some lines in news from California in those days, Proposition 215, all those things, and that was all weird for us here. But then our Minister of Health in 1997 actually announced a program for medicinal use of cannabis, and that immediately steered my interest. And I picked it up together with my colleague and brother-in-law at that time, co-founder also of the company back in 1984. And we said, this might be something really worthwhile to work on for, well, let's say for the well-being of patients and actually for helping in pain relief. That was one of the very clear things from the start, that cannabis could be very helpful in pain relief. What way and technically how it then worked, nobody knew at that time, but the stories were already there. There was, let's say, recreational use, and we know from the Netherlands also that patients were going to coffee shops actually to find relief in the use of cannabis. And that was with our background in horticulture and indoor production of certain types of vegetables, especially chicory. We had that experience and we said we can do something in that regard also. So that was where I really got interested in the plant, and the plant really came to me in a way that I said, this is meaningful and this makes sense to me. Yeah, that's basically how it all started and how we got also into the Dutch program.
And for folks that may be listening to this that work in the industry and perhaps have been self-isolating for many, many years before COVID have even happened, and maybe for folks that aren't in the industry that are listening to this, Could you give our listeners a bit of an overview of Bedrocan as an organisation itself?
Let's take it from the moment we started back in 1984, and it was a family company run by me and my brother-in-law, and we were basically in vegetables, but our focus was on indoor production. Once we were interested in the medicinal use of cannabis, we entered into a tender process with the Dutch government, and that ended in late 2002 when we were contracted. We received our first contract for production of medicinal cannabis. On that moment, we were a very, very tiny and small company. We were actually working with 3 people in the company and have a small number of part-time co-workers for harvesting purposes and processing purposes. From 2003 till 2013, basically, not so much happened. The world was big. And with regard to medicinal cannabis, very silent. Not so much was happening in those days. There was something going on in Canada a little bit, but that was also a government-run program. There was something going on in the US, but it was very minimal. The University of Mississippi actually was producing some cannabis for some patients and did a lot of research on the product. And that was basically it. There were in those years, two major organizations, medical organizations that were looking into the medical properties of cannabis. And then I'm talking about the IACM, the International Association for Cannabinoid Medicines, and the ICRS, the International Cannabinoid Research Society. That was an older one, already started in the 90s. And they were both focusing actually on the endocannabinoid system and to trigger that system with certain substances. Where the IACM actually was looking into cannabis, the ICRS was more looking into artificial substances, etc. Anyway, the world changed when Charlotte in the US, Charlotte Fick, was treated with CBD products. She was suffering from child epilepsy, and actually CBD cannabidiol helped treating her symptoms, and that was a breakthrough. That breakthrough led to recognition of cannabis as a medicine worldwide. And from that moment on, the business actually started booming more or less. However, and I am immediately saying however, we were part of a government program. And actually, the Dutch government is the responsible producer, or the producer responsible for the product. So we are basically contracted by the Dutch government, and the Dutch government is actually providing product to patients and exporting it to other countries for use by patients in those countries where no production is available and not in near sight. So that is how it all started. And our first export actually started already back in 2007 to Italy and Finland, small scale, few kilos annual. And in 2008, Germany came along. It's very interesting to see how things are developing right now, where people are saying, oh, Germany started it back in 2017. No, Germany already started in 2008 by importing small amounts of cannabis for direct use by patients. It was a very difficult program in those days. And the way they're doing it now, the access for patients is way easier than it ever has been. And Germany is actually the only European state where most of the cannabis is being reimbursed when prescribed by a medical doctor. We grew in that time from a company that was able to produce about 200 kilos of dried flower. We grew to a company that is now producing about 5 till 6 metric tons of dried flower annually. And we are ready to expand when needed and when possible. So we are actually acting upon need and demand in the market. And of course, we have a very intense cooperation with the Dutch Office of Medicinal Cannabis, which is the mandatory agency as required by the UN treaties that Holland still has in this form. And they are actually responsible for the product and the business.
There's a load of questions I want to bring up after that history. So I'll just get my thoughts in order, because I wanted to ask, did you go public at one point? But actually, I think the most interesting thing for our listeners after that discussion will be, how do you foresee the competition in the European market going now that there's loads of other GMP producers coming online? So you're capable of producing 6 tons, and there's loads of Canadian producers saying, we can produce 1 million tons, or whatever they're saying. Now, it's not actually in the market yet, but what's your instinct or your strategy for when eventually some of that supply does reach the market?
The proof is in the pudding, and that's a very famous English saying. And in this regard, it's always about product and product quality. GMP is telling you something about the systems you apply to produce and the carefulness in which you apply those systems. The actual product itself, the quality of the product itself, that's another story. So where they are testing right now, for instance, only on, let's say, cannabinoid content, mainly THC and CBD, we will see in the future a broader spectrum of substances on which a specific product will be checked. And that means that your level of standardization of your product needs to be really high. I'm quite adamant in the fact that we have that level of standardization. We are able to provide product that has a fixed amount of all the components that you will find back ongoingly. So not only cannabinoids, also the terpenes. And that's due to the growth system we've developed actually back in the 90s already. So quality of product in its full extent, in the full range of chemical compounds in the product, that's key. Then you need to show what this specific product can do for patients or does for patients. It means that you have to do your clinical work. I'm very clear on this. You can do it with cannabis. There are now devices for vaporization. There are cannabis. You can make certain tinctures or oils from cannabis that can be fully standardized based upon a standardized herbal product. And that way it is possible to actually start doing clinical trials with a standardized, full spectrum standardized product. And we see that happening already. We see that in the Netherlands, and we are a strong proponent from doing that clinical work. And that should be done by other companies as well. So what I was very surprised about when those Canadian companies and also American companies came to the surface and they started doing their work, they started investing in production expansion rather than going deep into the product itself and try to find the specifics of their products, their strains, the flowers they produce, try to standardize that and put money into clinical trials, because a medicinal product by default needs to be tested up to the highest level in order to avoid any problems afterwards. Everybody is aware of that, and everybody in the world also wants that. Nobody will rely on products of which today there's product X in it. Tomorrow you will find more of compound Y, and the day after you will find more of compound A in it. That's not how a medicine should look like. What people also don't like is, especially with regard to cannabis, is take out one chemical or two chemicals and that's it, because that's not the whole plant. So finding the middle here is the hardest part. But focus on the product. That is one of the things that is really lacking in the industry today. And I know it takes time. That's one of the key elements. You should take time to focus on your product and your product development in that regard. So I am not afraid for competition at all. I've always said that, because I know that competition, aside of quality, competition also has to build up the capabilities of growing and producing. And I have seen a lot of them. I have seen a lot of, especially Canadian operations. I've seen quite some US operations as well. And I was always intrigued by the fact that nobody was actually looking at the product. Everybody was only looking at sales and volume. And those are the two things I am not really interested in. And having said that, we are producing between 5 and 6 metric tons right now. That is what the demand is for our product. And there is more demand, we know that, but that's a regulatory issue we are dealing with right now to allow us to produce more at some point. But doing it the right way and doing it that way, it's a very profitable way either. We are a real for-profit company and we are making a profit on the product while our prices are relatively low. So a very simple example, the Dutch tender for medicinal cannabis has a fixed price already on the product, which is actually €2.35. Let's say in American dollars, just below $3 a gram. And that is for us a very profitable situation. Need I say more?
Now, one of the things you touched upon there were cannabis studies. Could you talk a little bit to the clinical research that you guys are doing and a part of?
We are involved basically in, let's say, 3 types of research. clinical research, so clinical effects of cannabis, we are involved in 2-3 studies in the Netherlands right now. We already have finished a study 2 years ago with the Leiden University Medical Center. That was a comparative study. It was a very interesting one. A comparative study on pain reduction with 3 types of products and placebo. What that study showed, and I go a little bit into the details because it's really interesting. That study showed actually that a combination, one plant variety called Bediol, containing about 6% of THC and about 8% of CBD, that one performed best in pain reduction for MS patients. Based upon that result, we are entering into a new study right now in which we say, with this specific product, are we able to replace opioids with cannabis for pain reduction in MS patients? So that's the next study we are getting into. We are also involved now in a study that's a study done by us or done by the University of Maastricht in the southern part of Holland. But that's basically financed by us. That is a study that also looks into pain relief in more general, lower back pain. So cramped muscles in your back, relief for that with cannabis. So that's another study. It's all focusing on pain mainly. Then we have other institutions and universities around the world that ask for our product to do their own research with. That's a second type of clinical studies we are involved in. We are obviously always interested in their results, but we don't lead those studies. We have no say in the goal of the study. And then the third type of studies we're doing is actually product related. So we do research, for instance, with some institutions in the UK even, but also in Australia, where we are looking into the specifics of the product. What can we do? What is actually needed? So can we produce other cannabinoid plants? Can we produce plants with specific terpene profiles? Whatever is needed. So creating skills among our coworkers to work with the plant in a way that we can actually steer the content with regard to cannabinoids, mostly by breeding. That's the way we do that. So, and of course, we are ongoing looking into the actual process that we apply on growing and processing the plants. But that's all product research. So that's basically our R&D work.
And talking about the effects of the products and quality in general, something that I think might be interesting to talk about is, how are you evaluating your product quality? What are the metrics? Are you looking for good patient experiences? Are you looking for good medical outcomes? And if so, how do you measure them? What is the barometer for quality that keeps you guys being the leading medical brand?
Quality in that regard means efficacy. So we see that more often with medicines. Some of the medicines don't taste that well, but they are effective. That's what we are looking for. I'm not looking for a specific taste or a specific effect in the brain that, makes you feel mellow or whatever. We are looking for efficacy with regard to pain and pain reduction. We are always open in general to patient comments on our product. We have been that from the start. So we have gathered interesting data over time. However, that's quite random information coming from patients directly. But from there, we always listen to the stories. We always want to know whether the product is effective for the specific condition the patient has. However, efficacy is a strange thing. So if you feel relieved in your head because you're having, and I'm phrasing it quite roughly, but if you feel lightheaded and you feel happy, then pain will get to a lower level of experience. It's one of the things we see with cannabis. Cannabis takes off the focus by many patients in their pain experience. And it allows them, it's one of the things we heard so often from patients. I can actually put my head up again and I can look into the world and I'm able to get through the day, rather than sitting down with my head down and only being bothered by pain. So that's really an important thing, of course. But measuring, that's the next step, of course, measuring this specific outcome by a patient, that the patient is telling us, this is what is happening to me. Creating the possibility to actually measure that is very important. And that is what we are looking for in our clinical work. So actually, we do clinical work on the basis of patient experiences. And then we also inform the doctors, this is what we hear from patients. This is what they tell us. If you are looking into efficacy, please look for this specific outcome. One of the very interesting things in the beginning was that it was advised to use cannabis in a herbal tea. There is some clinical result from herbal tea, but most of it doesn't work. And we got that comment back from patients always. Tea doesn't work.
Yeah, I can't imagine the bioavailability is really there at all.
Exactly. There's basically, it's none. And the thought behind it was curious because decarboxylation of THCA actually was an unknown, the decarboxylation of cannabinoids in general was an unknown fact in those years still. And it was when looking into that, we did it with the University of Leiden from the beginning onward, from 2003 onward. Looking into that, the first, with tea, of course, you could, and then all of a sudden, when they researched the tea, they immediately found there's no THC or CBD in the tea. There's only THCA and CBDA, and it sticks to the side of your glass, and it's a very bad way of bringing cannabinoids or cannabis into patients. So, and actually, patients were telling us that also, and patients were always telling us that inhalation worked the best for them. And that was where, as a company, we also started focusing on evaporation of cannabis as a direct way to titrate cannabis for effective use in pain situations. Peak pains in patients will not be helped by cannabis oil because ingestion of cannabinoids takes a while before it really hits you. So it can take up to an hour before you feel an effect of ingested cannabis, unless you have an ongoing intake of cannabis oil that, of course, brings you to a certain level. But treating peak pains, so sudden pains, cannabis inhalation is very effective. Not smoking, of course not. And it's why we have, as a company, we have been working hard on the vaporization route. One of the companies we are cooperating with in that regard is Psyche in Israel. I don't know whether you are familiar with Psyche, but Psyche actually has... Yes, exactly. One of the most advanced inhalers that allows for micro-dosaging of cannabis also very effectively. And that cooperation already is there since 2011. So we have a long-lasting relationship with them. And it works very well indeed. And they have done a lot of clinical work also already on their device with our product inside. Yeah.
And how important and I guess how challenging do you think it is and would be to have people's patients' experience being sort of taken to the top table of consideration when looking at products in medical studies and trials? Because, for my money, I can imagine a situation, and I've spoken with many people and patients, of course, who said that, for example, sometimes with some patients that in terms of symptom relief, pain might go down from 9 to 7 or 9 to 6, but actually the byproduct of that, of using cannabis and cannabis medicines, means that for the first time in years they're able to sleep, they're able to have appetite, etc., etc. How important do you think that is to the efficacy, and what do you think the challenges are in getting the scientific community to really, really acknowledge that experience on a par, or at least alongside to some degree, with symptom relief?
The scientific community is definitely willing to accept that on one condition, namely that you have a product that is stabilized and always the same. You can have 100 of those products. It's no problem. You can even have 100,000 of those products as long as each individual product is always the same. Now we're getting into a problem because cannabis, in general, even individual plants from the same variety can differ. And I want to give you an example, a very, very interesting example. We are doing field research in Southeast Asia. We have access to some spots where basically humans never come. We have done some studies there. And actually, we do see, even in land races that are just growing in the wild, no influence of humans or nearby. And we do see immense differences in those geographically at the same spot growing cannabis. We see huge differences in cannabinoid content. And I was very curious in the beginning to see whether it is possible that in just cannabis growing in the wild, whether it would be chemically stable, well, it's not. So don't expect cannabis to be chemically stable if you start breeding and you start working from seeds. Well, the cloning technique is very well known, of course, these days. And the cloning technique also allows indeed for much more standardization of your chemical content. And over the long term, and that's what we do actually, over the long term, you need to keep on cloning. And that is one of the problems we see many companies are struggling with. We developed a cloning technique that is different, and it allows for an ongoing system of cloning from the same genetic source. So talking about that, the plant varieties, our oldest plant varieties already go back to a single seed back in the 90s, somewhere early 90s, 1994, 1995, when we first developed certain varieties. So that basis, and then you can point at a certain product and you say, this product is always the same and it does this and this and that for me. And then you're getting more grip on that situation. Because, and going back to the sample of nature that we found, if I would have measured one plant only from the bunch of plants we found there, and that was full of THC, and actually there was one plant we found there that was full of CBD and not THC, or the THC level was significantly lower. And if you offer that to a patient blindfolded and say, well, this is the same plant, they come from the same area, and then you immediately will know what happened. A plant with low or very little THC and high CBD is, in its effect, is totally different compared to a plant with high THC and low or basically no CBD. So there are also, and then the other problem. It's not only the producer, it's also the one who is telling you what the content is, because you cannot see on the outside of the plant how much and what is in the plant. So a plant that looks very snowy or crystallized, whatever. I love the terminology and I do understand where it's coming from, but it doesn't make sense. You have to measure it in a lab. And there we are at problem number 2, the laboratory. What is the laboratory actually doing? How do they measure? And what do they measure? We have seen quite some issues arising there and still are issues arising there. It's very difficult for labs to have a stable result when we have done a lot of ring testing. I don't know whether you're familiar with that principle. So you have one sample of a product that's homogenized and it's, let's say, 100 grams and it's mixed and done and it's exactly the same. And then you send it to 10 different labs. Guess what? All the labs should have the same outcome. Nope, it never happens. The differences are not 20% here and they're 19% no. Here they measure 20% of THC and there they measure 14% of THC from the same sample. How does that come? Those are issues that really need to be solved also on a more global level in order to come to a fully standardized basis on which you can start building a platform that can produce medicine, true medicine, out of cannabis as a raw material, or actually the cannabis itself as a medicine.
That variance is a piece that I think trips up a lot of producers seeking to access generally the German market, which is the largest one that has a variance requirement. But have you guys solved that problem?
With the laboratories, not yet. We are working very hard on it. We also want to know, and we are deep in it already, in the production capabilities of the plant itself. What does the plant, when it's growing, what is the outcome? The flower on top of the plant or the flower on the bottom end of the plant, what are the differences? What is actually in the trichomes? What people call crystals is actually the scientific name for it is trichomes. It's an excrement of the plant. The plant is excreting the actual stuff from the actual chemical content. That excrement pops up as what we call trichomes. It's like little mushrooms on the outside of the leaves and the flower. That is what people call crystals. And in the little mushroom on the end is a little bulb, and in that bulb you will find the chemical content. Is the chemical content in each trichome the same? We do think so, but still there might be differences. So it's always a matter of going deep into what the plant also is doing actually. It's a living organism, and based upon the influences from the outside, the plant is responding to it with its chemical content. We also know that. So if it's hot or dry or cold or wet, or the plant is responding to that with its chemical content. That makes it very important to have your growing conditions the same. That is something that most producers nowadays are very aware of. Your growing conditions should be the same. And if they are not, it becomes more difficult to make a true medicine out of the dried flower itself. So all the outdoor and basically also greenhouse grow, people are using it to make extracts and to take chemical compounds out. That is what I agree to. That is indeed possible. However, the flower itself, having a standardized product from your flower, you need your genetic and your conditional standardization in full, and that means indoor production. That's the only way you can bring a flower to the market that is really standard on an ongoing basis. So today, but also in 10 years from now.
I'll assume that isn't a comment based on any particular competitors that have got large greenhouses in countries neighbouring. But to talk about the international regulatory landscape just a little bit, because I imagine you guys are probably one of the first people approached when new governments, etc., are thinking, right, if we actually want to have a medical cannabis program in our country, we need to understand what it's like. Do you have any thoughts on the future or the growing regularization in Europe?
Oh, don't get me started.
Boris Johnson, he hasn't come up to you and asked, will this work, has he?
No, not yet. But what we certainly do need is harmonization. Individual countries are having huge difficulties in setting up their programs. So we have seen a lot of governments dropping in with us over the past 10 years, varying from even the Thai government, but also the Danish government, the French government, the German government, obviously. I miss the UK government still, but we have some exchange of information with them in a more distant way. But so, we did that a lot. But what we need is harmonization in not only European, but also globally. And we need it quickly now because the industry is arising. The industry is also pushing. Governments should put their heads together now and come up with regulations that allow for certification of companies the right way. GMP certification is one. I'm a true fan of GMP certification. I also would like to see that the follow-up on GMP certification is done properly. So inspectors should inspect those facilities on an ongoing basis and keep track of them, especially in these days where we are now, where we are still dealing with a lot of cowboys in the industry. And let's be honest, it's a wild thing over the past 5 years. And it has been a wild ride for many of those companies and boards in those companies. However, all those governments, again, are depending on the United Nations. The United Nations, the agreements under the UN, the treaties, the 61 and 71 treaties, are the ones that give the direction for individual governments to deal with. But we need to go to the next level. So in the US, the federal government needs to take a position. And in Europe, the European Union should take a position in this and regulate. That is what is lacking right now. And I know that within the European situation, they are talking on a monthly basis now on the highest levels on cannabis as a medicine. But the differences between countries right now are still too big to allow for a harmonized regulation. But I do urge to start moving faster because trouble is arising right now. We see it among CBD companies. We see it especially the whole theme of CBD. What is CBD? Is it harmful or not? And how does it actually work? This is where a government and governments united should take the lead and come with regulations as soon as possible. And I know that in this regard, as soon as possible means it will take a few more years. But that's it. And I do think, indeed, that the whole development of cannabis as a medicine will take several more years in that regard. It's not a quick fix. There is no quick fix for it.
It sounds a little bit like we're going back to the old adage of sort of when America coughs, the whole world catches a cold, in terms of, really the world and Europe, of course, waiting on changes in America. I guess short of, federal illegality of cannabis being reversed in the States, do you think there is another way and another route to really kick off the harmonization of European legislation without that federal illegality going, which will kick into gear the United Nations, which will kick into gear things in Europe, etc., etc.?
in that regard, I would like to refer to the multi-purpose situation that cannabis is in, actually. So cannabis is being used as a recreational product. Cannabis is being used as a medicine. Cannabis is being used to actually make fiber, to make clothes, in the automotive industry. Cannabis can be used everywhere. So we need to recognize, as governments and regulatory organizations, but also as an industry, we need to recognize those differences and work towards a situation where all these different applications of cannabis are separated. You cannot make general legislation on cannabis because cannabis has so many purposes. You have to make legislation on the purpose for which you use it. That applies to the regulatory situation, but it also applies to the industry itself. You cannot produce cannabis as a commodity that goes to recreational users, and from the same jar you pick your medicine for patients that are severely ill or in severe pain. And actually the people don't want it either. If I was a patient and I had to go online to buy some cannabis in some store, I would do it probably because I'm in so much pain. Would I like it? No. I want to go to my doctor. I want to go to my pharmacist and I want to buy my product there. And the product that gives me relief. So that separation to me is mandatory in order to regulate the industry properly. We see quite well regulated fiber industry surrounding cannabis. However, we also see that industry all of a sudden became interested in CBD because fiber hemp, what is allowed in Europe and now also in North America, does contain CBD to a certain level. And all of a sudden, those fiber farmers got into the CBD game, but nobody knows actually what they're doing, and there are no regulations for it. So governments, and the Dutch government somehow has been doing it. They actually prohibit the use of fiber hemp to make CBD from, unless it's done as medicinal cannabis. However, medicinal cannabis is monopolized by the Dutch government, so whatever comes from the field here cannot be used for CBD production. But then you see a difference. The Dutch farmers bring their hemp harvest to Germany, which is, 50 kilometers away, or 100 kilometers away. They bring it to Germany. There it's being processed into CBD, and that CBD is allowed to come back into Holland. So there you see the lack in proper arrangements, agreements, how to organize it properly. That's far away still, and it's very difficult. And I'm talking for Europe now especially. It's very difficult in Europe to harmonize that, let alone that they can harmonize medicinal cannabis right now. That is, and come to a situation in which, for instance, standardization, the full chemical standardization becomes mandatory. That's one of the things I think needs to happen. But let's see what happens over the next few years. They are at the highest level working on it. I know that the INCB, the watchdog from the narcotic watchdog from the UN, is looking into the situation right now. They are working on basically rewriting the rules. And I hope that within a year from now, we'll see some result from that.
I think we've probably got time for maybe one or two quick questions before we have to end the episode here. So something that's been on my mind, actually, that I wanted to know that's possibly not so important, but maybe is from a branding perspective. Where does the Bedrocan name come from, and how does that feed into the naming of your other products like Bediol and Bedica?
That's a very simple answer, actually, but it's still a fun story. The B is from Browning in English. That's my brother-in-law. The E is from Erkelens. That's me. So that's the B and the E. And the DRO is an abbreviation in Dutch from the word dried, and can obviously is cannabis. So it's Browning and Erkelens dried cannabis, Bedrocan. The company had a different name before that. And when we were contracted by the Dutch government, they said, oh, yeah, your company is registered with the Chamber of Commerce and all the address information is available there. So you cannot work under your original company name. We need a new name with a new address. And that was on a Friday evening, and I had to come up with a new name on Monday morning because they wanted to do a press release. Okay, that was where I ended up at a Saturday morning with my wife on the kitchen table and said, we need a new name. So we started puzzling with letters and stuff, and this is the name that came out of it. So Bruce Linton will still remember when I had my first talk with Bruce back in 2015. where he sat across me and said, it took me almost a year to create the name Tweed, therapeutic weed, and the writing and how it should be. He said, and finally we made it, and it's a very catchy name. And I like your name too, Bedrocan. I like the name. I said, oh, it took me 15 minutes, but it took me 20. It took me 20 years to make a product. So that was a very interesting discussion at that time. So the branding in that regard, it never has been on purpose. We never have been thinking about it. We just needed another name, and this was it. And apparently it sticks with people now, and well, that's good. I have no problem with it.
Well, that is fantastic. It is a great name. And Tjalling, this has been a great interview. Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for today. We cannot wait to have you back next series. But for the time being, Tjalling, thank you so much for joining us on the Professionally Cannabis podcast.
You're more than welcome. Thank you very much.
Where do they go? The smoke rings I blow each night.
Hey there, listener. We hope you enjoyed that interview with Tjalling. We certainly did. And he is undoubtedly one of the pioneers in terms of bringing cannabis to thousands and thousands of patients across many countries. And listener, if you did enjoy the interview with Tjalling, please do support the pod by subscribing, if not already, and also passing the pod on to a friend or colleague. We have a whole array of interviews with cannabis business leaders, with leaders in policy, with leaders in science, and yeah, check out the back catalogue. But for the time being, thank you so much for tuning in once more, and we will see you next time.
Hello, please take me above. Take me with you.